We're now going to have a look at ISO, which is the camera sensor's sensitivity, or the pixel's sensitivity to light. And it's expressed as ISO, which is just an acronym for the International Standards Organization that give it these particular numbers. So along with shutter speed and aperture, ISO is the last of the controls we use to affect exposure, and we'll be covering exposure in a future video, but this is just one element of exposure. And it forms the third part of our exposure triangle. So we've got shutter speed, which we've covered, aperture and ISO, and these all interrelate with each other when we're calculating the exposure, or the camera does when it's on automatic. Okay, so the three main controls that affect exposure. So the sensitivity of each pixel is rated, or the sensors is rated in ISO numbers. You may be familiar with 100 ISO, 200, 400, and generally they go in steps of double, 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 although for certain cameras and things we do have intermediate steps as well. So when we were using film, I don't think you'd find a film much quicker than 1600 ISO, and they would also go into the lower numbers as well. Some of the first Kodachromes were around about 6 ISO, or as it was 6 ASA in the olden days. And with digital cameras we can actually change the ISO sensitivity for each individual image. Whereas with film, you have to actually buy film rated for a specific speed, and of course you had to use the entire film before you could change the ISO rating and had to put a different film in. So it's a lot more convenient these days. And here we can see on my camera the ISO that I've selected here, 800 ISO. So this change in sensitivity is achieved by the camera changing the electrical charge on the sensor, and that's important. So each ISO jump either doubles or halves the sensor's sensitivity to light. So 100 ISO is the least sensitive to light. Double it to 200, so twice the sensitivity to light. Twice, 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 twice. And of course half, half, half as we go down the scale. And these numbers are incremented in what we call stops, because it's a double the speed, double the speed, double the speed, half the speed, half the speed, just like we did in shutter speed and aperture in stops. The thing is, with all electrical processes generate some sort of noise, and these are unwanted noises. So as the sensor changes these speeds by applying a higher electrical charge to the sensor as the ISO rating goes up. And as the charge increases on the sensor, so does the amount of noise generated, because as well as increasing the sensitivity to light, it also increases the amount of inherent noise in the sensor as well. So you can see here that the 100 ISO, we get the really good quality, and as we increase the ISO, although we're able to take pictures in darker conditions and using faster shutter speeds, the quality of the resulting image deteriorates as we go up the scale. Older cameras are far worse at handling high ISOs than the latest types, and some of the latest types can go up to bonkers type of ISO ratings and still get acceptable quality from them. Also, generally, the smaller the pixels on a camera sensor, so if you're using a smaller sensor size camera, generally the higher the ISO performance, the worse the performance becomes as you go up the ISO scale. So larger sensors tend to handle high ISOs better than smaller sensors, because each sensor can only capture so much light, and if it's a very small sensor it will get a very small amount of light, therefore it needs a higher electrical charge to increase the signal to a manageable level. So If we imagine that our signal, our image signal, that's the amount of light coming in onto the sensor, is the green, and the signal noise, that's the electrical random noise generated, is the red. So at 100 ISO, we've got loads and loads of signal from the light and very little noise generated. So the light tends to mask out any sort of noise generated by the background electrical signal. So we get a really good pure image. 200, and of course in order to increase the sensitivity, so the background noise increases as well, the unwanted noise, just a little bit. 400, 800, you get the idea. So by the time we start to get into the higher ISOs, this noise ratio compared to the light signal is starting to overwhelm it. By the time we get to the really high ISOs, we're getting so much noise that the image becomes almost unusable. Okay, and of course for different cameras this kind of incline changes depending on the camera. Okay, so this illustrates something, an image that was taken at 6400 ISO, and it's been accentuated just for illustrative purposes. Now the color speckles, all these colory speckles here, they indicate what's called color noise, and the brightness speckles, just the lighter and darker areas, they indicate luminance noise. Now noise can be controlled with software, and you'll find that color noise can be controlled far more successfully than luminance noise. Noise tends to increase to be greatest in the shadow areas because of the linear nature of the capture of a digital image. There's far less data within a darker area, so any changes in tone and everything have to be amplified far more, and of course the background noise gets amplified a lot more, so you get a lot more noise in the shadow areas. So reasons to use high ISO settings. Now if you recall back to the olden days when we used to have films and no exposure meters or anything, we had a thing called the Sunny 16 rule that stated that if you use a 100 ISO film or digital sensor set to 100 ISO and a shutter speed of 100/100th, or the closest match is 125th, and an aperture of f16, hence the Sunny 16 rule, so 100 ISO, shutter speed of 100. Now if it was 200 ISO, it'd be a shutter speed of 200, 400 ISO, 400, aperture of f16. Okay? So on a sunny day, this image will be correctly exposed without having to resort to an exposure meter. So that was a handy little rule in the olden days. So an aperture of f11, which lets in more light than f16, we can it's double the amount of light, isn't it? It's one stop. So we can change our shutter speed from 125th, reduce the amount of light coming in by shortening the exposure by half, so it's 125th of a second. So f11, the shutter speed will be 125th, and you could work out all these the correct exposures for different apertures and shutter speeds in your head if you knew the Sunny 16 rule and it was a sunny day. Okay, so anyhow, fast action requires high shutter speeds to freeze the movement and to prevent obvious blurring. Now this swan is moving at quite a crack, and unless we have a high shutter speed, we're going to get lots and lots of blurring. Even in the wingtips here, we can see quite a bit of blurring. But I also needed, because it's quite close, I needed quite a reasonable depth of field, and I thought maybe f11 would be sufficient for this sort of shot. Now 100 ISO, using the Sunny 16 rule, we could also use your exposure meter of course in the camera, but it would come out with the same sort of thing. So at 100 ISO, we'd only have a shutter speed of 1/250th of a second. That isn't sufficient for this sort of shot. So by increasing the ISO, we can maintain our aperture of f11 and then get a sufficient shutter speed. So if we look at ISO, aperture and shutter speed, and remember each one of these is in stops, so they all interrelate with one another. So there's our Sunny 16 rule, 100 ISO, f16, 100th of a second, or the closest match is 125th. If we stay at 100 ISO, we can change the aperture to f11, and that would allow us to get a shutter speed of 250th of a second. If we increase the ISO to 200, same aperture, f11, we can increase the shutter speed to 500th of a second. 400 ISO, aperture 11, 1,000th of a second. Okay, because they're in stops, we can once we change one stop, we can change another stop. So by the time we get to 800 ISO, f11, we're at a shutter speed of 2,000th of a second. And of course we can go higher to 4,000th of a second. But I know that my camera doesn't really handle ISO 1600 very well. So I set it to 800 ISO, which gives me a shutter speed of 2,000th of a second, which managed to arrest most of the image. Now, due to poor lighting, this required, if we're using the sun, well, an exposure, it wasn't the Sun 16 rule, but if it came out at an exposure of a 30th of a second at an aperture of 5.6, an ISO of 100. Okay, now this is too slow a shutter speed for this sort of action. So again, we can go back to our little chart here. 100 ISO, 5.6, 30th, not quick enough. 200 ISO, 5.6, 1/60th of a second, and we can keep on going up the scale like this. Double the ISO, we can quicken the shutter speed by double as well. Okay, we can go all the way up to something like that. So I chose 2,000th of a second because I know that the camera would not be able to handle 1200 ISO. The grain and the noise would be just too horrendous. Okay. So something like this sort of image where all the lighting is controlled, you're on a tripod, 100 ISO. Get the best quality you can. So reasons to increase ISO speed, the need for faster shutter speeds, the need for smaller apertures whilst retaining sufficiently high shutter speeds, and maybe for effect as well if you wanted a grainy effect. So for this sort of image, although it's a sort of action shot, I needed a reasonably slow shutter speed, 500th of a second, reasonably slow, in order to get the propellers still moving and some of the other bits and pieces. But I was reasonably confident I could keep the aeroplane reasonably sharp by panning. So 200 ISO, 500th of a second, f11. On a tripod, 400 ISO, and I managed to get these because it was in quite dark an area. With a jet like this moving really quickly, 800 ISO, it was quite an overcast conditions as well. Bird in flight, these sort of shots need really fast shutter speeds, so 800 ISO. 1600 ISO, horrible conditions in order to get that. This was in an aquarium, 3200 ISO. And here's one that I did take at 25,000 ISO, and you can see that the noise is virtually obliterated the light signal. So those are the principles for using ISO, and later on we'll see how it all integrates with exposure.